What is going on, guys? Welcome back to another video. So every single season in the NHL, there's one team that has extremely high expectations, safely make the playoffs, maybe even win the Stanley Cup, and they fall extremely short, whether that's just barely make the wild card and then lose in 4 or 5 games, or completely miss the playoffs, or be one of the worst teams in the entire NHL. So I thought it'd be a fun idea to go through the last 8 seasons and give you the most disappointing team every single year based on preseason expectations and where they ended up. So without further ado, let's get into it. Yes, it is July 10th. We are already deep in the offseason doing videos like this, but let's go. Up first in 2024, it's obviously the New Jersey Devils. This picture of Jack Hughes kind of encapsulates it. Coming into the season, they were fresh off 112 points after jumping 49 points the season prior, and we all expected them to yet again be an elite team. Coming into the season, they had plus 1,000 odds, 10-1 odds to win the Stanley Cup, which was only behind the Carolina Hurricanes and the Colorado Avalanche in terms of the best in the NHL, as well as having a points over-under of 105.5, and rightfully so, considering they had Luke Hughes and Simone Nemec coming up. They got a full season of Timo Meier after getting him at the deadline. Luke Hughes, another season of progression. Dawson Mercer had like 57 or 56 points the year prior. We all expected the New Jersey Devils to be an absolute powerhouse. You're lying if you didn't have them at least in the playoffs. I had them second in the Metro Division, making the Stanley Cup final. But then it all kind of blows up in their face. The goalie tandem, Akira Schmid, looked like he was taking serious steps last year in the playoffs. He plays horrible. Vanacek plays horrible. Dougie Hamilton goes down after just 20 games. They got to bring in Nemec, who is fantastic for them, but he's not Dougie Hamilton. Luke Hughes has a good rookie year, but he's not yet like an elite top pairing guy. So when looking at it, they just kind of blow up. They finish with 81 points, end up picking 10th overall. They end up selling at the deadline, trading away Tyler Toffoli, as well as trying to juggle their goalie position. It was an utter disaster. It is one of the biggest collapses. It's probably on this list. I'd put it either probably second or third in terms of the most disappointing seasons. Again, this was a young team, and out of nowhere, they just completely collapse overall. In 2023, this might be a little bit, I don't think this is controversial, but you might forget how much hype this team had. But I'm going to go with the Calgary Flames. The 2023 Calgary Flames were extremely disappointing because although, yes, they traded away Matthew Tkachuk, at the time, people thought Huberdeau was either better than Matthew Tkachuk or about the same player, considering the fact Jonathan Huberdeau had 116 points the year prior. And even if you thought Tkachuk was maybe better than Huberdeau at the time, they also got Mackenzie Weegar, and they got a first-round pick. And yes, they lost Johnny Gaudreau, but they picked up Nazem Kadri, who had 87 points in 71 games. Yes, he was on Colorado. It wasn't going to translate over, but you thought that could be their number one center, a very, very good second-line center. Coming into the season, they had the 11th best Stanley Cup odds, as well as a points over-under of 102.5. So they were expected to maybe take a step back, maybe not win the Pacific Division, but still pretty safely make the playoffs in the Western Conference. That obviously did not happen. They finished with 93 points. Huberdeau fell off a cliff to 55 points. 32-year-old Nazem Kadri in the first year of a 7x7 had 56 points. And mind you, before the season, Huberdeau signed the 8-year by $10.5 million contract. And Jacob Markstrom just sucked after being the Vezina finalist, Vezina runner-up in 2022. He had an 892. This season maybe is kind of like a blessing, although it was very disappointing in the moment. Kind of is a blessing in disguise because it did send them into a rebuild, but there is no doubt, I feel like people, again, forget how much expectations, even after Brad Treliving wanted to compete with the score. He thought heading into 2022, 2023, this team could still compete at a high level, and they weren't some horrendous team by any stretch, but the fact that they missed it by like 3 or 4 points to like a pretty, I'm trying to think who made it that year. It was like the Winnipeg Jets or someone like that made the final wild card spots. Very disappointing for the Calgary Flames. In 2022, this might be one of the most disappointing teams of recent memory. The Vegas Golden Knights, this big three that they formed when they traded for Jack Eichel at the start of the season. You thought Eichel, Pacioretty, Stone was going to be the best line in the entire NHL, but when looking at it, Pacioretty played just 39 games that season. Stone played 37. Eichel played 34, and they were full, all-in win-now mode, and they end up missing the playoffs by like 3 to 4 points. Nashville Predators were the last team to get in, and they didn't even have their first round pick because they traded in the Jack Eichel trade, and it ended up becoming Noah Ostlund, who is a pretty damn good prospect. So when looking at Vegas, you really thought that Jack Eichel was going to be the icing on top of the cake, and he was in 2023, obviously, but heading into the 2021-2022 season, you thought the Vegas Golden Knights, I think after they traded for Eichel, they were top 3 in Stanley Cup odds, but it really just collapsed at the end of the season. They couldn't stay healthy. and the greatest line ever, the best line in the NHL that people presumed, ended up playing like 11 games together total. It was an utter disaster, but clearly not so much going forward as they won the Stanley Cup in 2023. Maybe they needed this massive disappointment in order to eventually win the Stanley Cup the following season. In 2021, I had two choices. I thought maybe the Dallas Stars, considering the fact that they made the Stanley Cup final in 2020, was the bubble. It was a little bit weird, but the following season they ended up missing the playoffs. But I ended up going with the Philadelphia Flyers. When looking at the Flyers, they were the number one seed in the bubble after going 3-0 in the round robin. They had 89 points in 69 games before the COVID shutdown, good for a 106-point pace. Everything was cooking for Philadelphia. Carter Hart, at 21 years old, had a 9-14 in only 43 games. He was looking like their future franchise goaltender. They made the second round in the bubble, lost my New York Islanders though, ha ha ha. But when looking at them, they had a loaded top six of Travis Konechny, Sean Couturier, Claude Giroux, Jacob Voracek, JVR, and Kevin Hayes. When all those players 4 years ago still were very high-level players, they had two legit stars, arguably three, with Konechny, Couturier, and Claude Giroux. It was one of the best top sixes in the entire NHL, but when looking at it, despite coming into the season with the fifth best cup odds at plus 1,400, an over-under of 67.5 points, mind you, this was the COVID-shortened season, so 56 games, they finished with 58 points, eighth in the Eastern Division. Nobody on the team finished with more than 43 points, and Carter Hart, 877 in 27 games. Carter Hart's obviously out of the NHL at this point, but this was really shocking at the time considering how good he was at 20 and 21. He fell off a massive cliff, and similarly to the Calgary Flames, this kind of sent the team into a massive rebuild, into a retool. After this, Sean Couturier got hurt. They ended up trading Claude Giroux and getting rid of some other guys. This was just, you thought that the Philadelphia Flyers window was going to be open for at least another year or two, at least till like 2023, 2024, and then in 2021, they just absolutely shat the bed in terms of a team and just showed how far off they actually were behind some of the other Eastern Conference teams. Next up, we got 2020, the 2019-2020 season, and I'm going to go with the San Jose Sharks. Similarly to other teams mentioned before, this is when everything fell off. The prior season, they made the Eastern Conference Finals with 101 points. They were still a very, very competitive team. This was one of the deeper teams in the Western Conference. They did lose Joe Pavelski that 2019 offseason, but still had 18-1 odds to win the Stanley Cup. But their older guys really fell off in this season. Joe Thornton went from 55 points the prior year in around 70 games to 31 points in 70 games. Brett Burns went from having 83 points, being an absolute offensive workhorse from the blue line, to only having 45 and 70. Hurdle, Carlson, Couture all missed around 15 plus games. It was a disaster. They ended up finishing with 63 points in 68 games, finishing dead last in the Pacific Division, and only the Senators and the Wings were worse in the entire NHL. They went from the second most goals in 2018-2019 to having the 27th. And again, like the Flames, like the Philadelphia Flyers, this basically sent them into a pretty nuclear rebuild. Within like 3 years, basically every single big name for the most part was off the roster. I guess 4 years leading up to this season. But this was really disappointing from the San Jose Sharks. It wasn't shocking, but again, you thought that these guys would still have a couple more years, considering guys, I think Evander Kane was still on the team. Logan Couture still had a high level. Tomas Hurdle, there were still solid guys in their prime. Yes, Joe Pa and Brett Burns fell off, but still very disappointing for the San Jose Sharks. In 2019, the LA Kings really fell off as well. There was still some pieces from the 2012, from the 2014 core. The year prior, they did have 98 points. They weren't some absolute wagon, but they were a first-round exit, 98 points. They had 30-1 preseason odds, so it's not as favored as the teams mentioned, but the fall-off was pretty stark. They ended up having 71 points, in part because of the disastrous decision to bring in Ilya Kovalchuk on a 3-year deal at $6.25 million. His first season, he had 34 points in 64 games. Yeah, they had the second worst record in the entire NHL. Jonathan Quick was very bipolar towards the end of the 2010s. This was one of the down years, clearly. He had an 888 in 46 games. Kopitar looked like he started to fall off. He was 31 or 32 at the time. He only had 60 points in 81 games. They ended up trading Jake Muzzin at the deadline to the Toronto Maple Leafs. So this looked like the end, even for the Kopitar, Quick, and Doughty era, even though Kopitar and Doughty obviously bounced back, and now they're still playing at a very high level. But at the time, this was a massive fall off, and the Kings didn't make the playoffs the following two seasons, so this really sent them into this mini retool this year. They kind of got screwed. They ended up taking Alex Turcotte fifth overall, but eventually it would lead to Quinton Byfield in 2020 and Brent Clark in 2021. But yeah, this was very disappointing and kind of the end of that 2012-2014 outside of Kopitar and Doughty, obviously. But that core never, it was the end of that. Basically, they had to hit the reset button because they were so bad. In 2018, the Edmonton Oilers really shat the bed. The prior season, you thought the decade of darkness was over when looking at it. They had 102 points. They made the second round of the playoffs. Connor McDavid won the Hart Trophy. So you thought, oh, we're going to get another growth from McDavid. Leon Draisaitl had 70 points the year prior. Darnell Nurse is only 22, 23. Clefbaum's still young. RNH is still pretty young. We're going to yet again be a high-level team. And they had the second best Stanley Cup odds heading into the season, only behind the Pittsburgh Penguins at 975. But basically everything went to shit. Connor McDavid, he did take another step. He won the Ted Lindsay in 2018, even though the team didn't make the playoffs. They only had 78 points. So when looking at it, Draisaitl actually had less points than the year prior. They traded Eberle for Strome that offseason. That was a disaster. Only 3 players had more than 35 points on this team. Cam Talbot took another step back, and they wouldn't make the actual playoffs until 2021. I know the COVID bubble, they were on pace to make the playoffs then, but they lost to the Blackhawks, and they wouldn't win a single playoff game until 2022 because obviously 2021 they got swept by the Winnipeg Jets. But when looking at it, you really expect the Edmonton Oilers to arrive on the scene after 2017, and they completely shat the bed. And then lastly, I got the Dallas Stars in 2017. We were still in the thick of the Sagan and Ben era, them playing at a very high level. They had 109 points the year prior, made the second round. They lost to Alex Goligoski, who was their number one defenseman back in 2016. So Klingberg was kind of running the show, and it went south very quick. They only had 79 points. Their offense went from the best offense in the entire NHL in 2016 to 17th. Ben, Sagan, and Spezza all had pretty big down years, and the Lettinen and Niemi tandem went from being one of the best in the entire NHL to being one of the worst, and as a result, they missed the playoffs by a decent amount. So here are the last 8. Devils 2024, Flames 2023, Knights 2022, Flyers 2021, Sharks 2020, Kings 2019, Oilers 2018, and in 2017, the Dallas Stars. Let me know in the comments, what do you think? What are some other teams that have massively disappointed in prior years? I'll be seeing the next one.